When my innocent client was convicted of murder with evidence I swore didn't exist 12 hours earlier, I looked across the courtroom at my prosecutor husband and saw him smile. That's when I knew Preston hadn't just been destroying my career for the past 8 months. He'd been destroying innocent women's lives, and I had been too drugged and confused to see it happening right in front of me. If you've ever watched someone you love transform into a monster before your eyes, please stay with me. This story gets darker before it gets better, but I promise you it ends with justice. The kind of justice that sends corrupt prosecutors to the same prisons they filled with innocent people. My name is Harper Caldwell, and I used to be one of Seattle's top criminal defense attorneys. Used to be. Past tense. Because on that Tuesday morning in March, standing in King County Superior Court, watching Judge Morrison read the guilty verdict for my client Diane Chen, I felt my entire world crack open like an egg against concrete. Diane was sobbing. Her mother was screaming from the gallery that this was a mistake, that her daughter didn't kill anyone. The jury looked uncomfortable but certain, convinced by the mountain of forensic evidence that had somehow materialized in the prosecution's case overnight. Evidence I knew for a fact had not existed when I reviewed the discovery files at midnight in my home office. I could feel every eye in that courtroom on me. Harper Caldwell, the attorney who never lost a murder case in 7 years. Harper Caldwell, who had just spectacularly failed to save an innocent woman from life in prison. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurring at the edges. And across the aisle, Preston Whitfield, senior prosecutor for King County and my husband of 4 years, was gathering his files with the satisfied efficiency of someone who had just won exactly what he intended to win. He caught my eye as the bailiffs led Diane away in handcuffs. For just a second, his mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating flash across his face, something that looked almost like satisfaction mixed with contempt. Then he smiled at me. Not the warm smile I'd fallen in love with. This was different, sharper, the smile of a predator who had just successfully hunted his prey. My stomach turned to ice. I stumbled out of the courtroom and barely made it to the women's restroom before my legs gave out. I sat on the cold tile floor of a bathroom stall in the King County Courthouse, my $500 suit pressed against institutional gray walls, and tried to understand what had just happened. The evidence. The DNA report placing Diane at the murder scene. The witness statement from a neighbor I'd never heard mentioned in any prior disclosure. The security footage timestamp that contradicted Diane's alibi. All of it had appeared in the prosecution's final exhibit list yesterday afternoon, too late for me to properly investigate or challenge. I'd spent the entire night reviewing my own files, searching for any reference to this evidence in the original discovery. Nothing. It was like it had materialized out of thin air, or like someone had deliberately withheld it from me until the last possible moment, knowing I wouldn't have time to respond effectively. But that would be prosecutorial misconduct. That would be grounds for mistrial. That would be exactly the kind of career-ending move that no prosecutor would ever risk, unless they knew they wouldn't get caught. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Text from Sloan Martinez, my best friend and law partner at Caldwell and Martinez Defense Associates, the firm we'd built together from nothing over the past 3 years, the firm that had just suffered its first major loss. Harper, where are you? The Chen family wants to talk about appeal options. Also, we need to discuss the Brennan case. Discovery deadline is Friday. I stared at the message, watching the words blur and refocus. The Brennan case. Another high-profile murder defense. Another client who swore she was innocent. Another case where Preston was lead prosecutor. I pulled myself up from the bathroom floor and looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sinks. I looked exhausted. Dark circles under my gray eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. My dark hair pulled back in a bun that had come half undone during the trial. I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks, which wasn't far from the truth. But it was more than just exhaustion. There was something off about my own face, something I couldn't quite identify. A sort of disconnection, like I was looking at a stranger. For the past 8 months, I'd been experiencing these episodes. Moments of confusion during important meetings. Brief periods where I couldn't remember conversations I'd apparently had. Times when I'd find documents in my briefcase that I had no memory of printing. Preston kept telling me I was working too hard, that I needed to rest more, that the stress of building a law practice was catching up with me. He'd been so supportive, making sure I took my vitamins every morning, preparing herbal tea for me every night to help me sleep better. The herbal tea. I thought about the bitter aftertaste I'd been ignoring for months now. The way I'd been falling into such deep sleeps that Preston could apparently leave our bed at 3 a.m. for emergency case preparation, and I never noticed. The strange reality that every single case I'd lost in the past 8 months had been cases where Preston was the opposing prosecutor. Standing there in that courthouse bathroom, staring at my own exhausted reflection, I felt the first crack of terrible understanding begin to split open in my mind. What if Preston wasn't supporting me through a difficult time? What if Preston was creating the difficult time? I made it back to my office somehow, driving through downtown Seattle traffic on autopilot, while my mind spun through every interaction I'd had with Preston over the past 8 months. Our office was on the 14th floor of a glass tower near Pike Place Market, with views of Elliott Bay that normally calmed me. Today, the water looked gray and threatening. Sloane was waiting in my office, her dark eyes full of concern the moment she saw my face. She told me to sit down, that I looked like I was about to collapse. I did collapse, actually, into my leather desk chair that suddenly felt too big for my body. Sloane closed the door and asked me what was wrong, said that losing a case wasn't the end of the world, that we'd file an appeal and find the problems in the prosecution's evidence. But I couldn't find the words to explain what I was beginning to suspect. How do you tell your best friend and business partner that you think your husband might be deliberately sabotaging your cases? It sounded insane even in my own head. Instead, I asked Sloane about the evidence in the Chen case. When exactly had the prosecution disclosed those final exhibits? She pulled up her email on her phone and showed me. Yesterday, at 4:47 p.m., less than 18 hours before trial concluded, the email had come from Preston's office with an apologetic note about how these materials had been mistakenly omitted from earlier discovery due to a filing error. The message sounded perfectly reasonable, perfectly innocent. Mistakes happened in complex litigation, except Preston didn't make filing errors. In 6 years as a prosecutor, his case files were legendary for their meticulous organization. I asked Sloane if she remembered me reviewing those documents last night. She looked confused and said of course I had reviewed them, that I'd called her around 11 p.m. to discuss strategy for addressing the new evidence in closing arguments. But I had no memory of that phone call. None. I pulled up my phone log, and there it was. 11:14 p.m., outgoing call to Sloane. Duration 23 minutes. 23 minutes of conversation I could not remember having. Sloane's expression shifted from concern to something closer to fear. She asked me if I was feeling okay, if maybe I should see a doctor. I told her about the other memory gaps, about the confusion during depositions, about waking up exhausted every morning despite supposedly sleeping 9 hours. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me about Preston, about our relationship, about whether everything was all right at home. The question felt like a door opening onto something dark. I found myself telling Sloane things I hadn't articulated even to myself. How Preston had become increasingly interested in my cases over the past year. How he always asked detailed questions about my trial strategies and client information. How he'd convinced me to set up a home office where I could work more comfortably, and how helpful he'd been in setting up the computer system and network. How he'd started making my morning coffee and evening tea around the same time the memory problems began. Sloane's face went very still. She asked me if I'd ever noticed anything strange about the tea. The question landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through my consciousness. The bitter aftertaste. The immediate drowsiness. The way Preston always watched me drink it. Always waited until the cup was empty before he relaxed. I felt my heart start pounding in my chest. Sloane leaned forward and told me something she'd been hesitant to mention before. She'd run into my predecessor, the attorney who'd worked Preston's cases before me, about 2 months ago at a bar association event. The woman, Patricia Summers, looked terrible, thin and worn down and nervous. When Sloane mentioned my name, Patricia had grabbed her arm and told her to tell me to be careful, that Preston Whitfield destroyed careers. I sat frozen in my chair, processing this information. I asked Sloane why she hadn't told me this before. She said she thought Patricia was just bitter about losing cases, that prosecutors and defense attorneys always had antagonistic relationships, that she hadn't wanted to worry me with gossip. But now, seeing me like this, she was scared she'd made the wrong choice in staying quiet. I needed to know more about Patricia Summers. I needed to know if what I was beginning to suspect about Preston had happened to her, too. That evening I told Preston I had to work late on the Brennan case. He seemed pleased, told me not to overdo it, that I needed to take care of myself. He kissed my forehead before leaving the office, and I had to force myself not to pull away. The moment he was gone, Sloane and I started digging into Patricia Summers' history. What we found made my blood run cold. Patricia had been a rising star in criminal defense 3 years ago, winning 87% of her cases. Then she'd started dating Preston Whitfield. They'd been together for 18 months. During that time, her win rate dropped to 32%. She lost her partnership at a major firm. She was sanctioned twice by the Bar Association for missing court deadlines, and then she disappeared from Seattle entirely. Sloane managed to find a current phone number through a legal directory. Patricia was now practicing family law in Spokane, about 300 miles away. Small cases, uncontested divorces, nothing like the high-profile criminal defense work she'd been known for. I called the number with shaking hands. A woman answered, her voice cautious and tired. I told her my name was Harper Caldwell, that I was married to Preston Whitfield, and that I needed to know what he did to her. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Patricia Summers started talking, and what she told me confirmed my worst fears and revealed something even more terrifying than I'd imagined. Patricia's voice came through the phone line thin and strained, like someone who'd been holding her breath for years and had just been given permission to exhale. She told me she'd been waiting for this call, that she knew Preston would eventually do to someone else what he'd done to her. She asked me if I'd been experiencing memory problems, confusion, exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. When I said yes to all three, I heard her make a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She said she recognized the pattern because she'd lived through it herself. Patricia explained that it started about 6 months into her relationship with Preston. He'd been so attentive, so supportive of her career. He'd encouraged her to work from home more often, had set up a beautiful office for her in his apartment. He'd made her tea every night to help her relax after stressful days in court. She'd thought she was lucky to have found such a caring partner, but then the memory gaps started. The confusion during trials. The inexplicable losses on cases she should have won easily. She'd go to bed with case files perfectly organized and wake up to find documents missing or changed. Evidence she swore she'd reviewed would somehow not be in her materials when she needed it in court. I asked Patricia if she'd ever confronted Preston about it. She said she had, eventually, after she'd lost 3 major cases in a row, and her law firm partners started questioning her competence. Preston had been so convincing in his concern. He'd suggested she was having a breakdown from stress, that she should see a therapist, maybe take some time off. He'd even offered to help her review her case files to figure out what went wrong. Looking back, Patricia realized that was when he'd been most dangerous. When she'd been most vulnerable and confused, he'd positioned himself as her only support system. The breaking point came when Patricia secretly recorded herself sleeping one night. She'd set up her phone on the nightstand because she kept waking up with the feeling that something had happened during the night that she couldn't remember. What the recording captured made her leave Preston's apartment immediately and never go back. The audio showed Preston waiting until she was deeply unconscious, then spending hours going through her laptop, She could hear him on the phone with someone, discussing her cases, sharing confidential client information, talking about evidence that could be used against her clients. At one point on the recording, Preston had laughed and said something that still haunted Patricia. He'd said that destroying defense attorneys was even more satisfying than winning cases because it was a 2-for-1 deal. You got the conviction, and you eliminated competition. My hands were gripping my phone so hard my knuckles had gone white. I asked Patricia what she did with the recording. She said she'd gone to the Bar Association's ethics committee with everything she had. But Preston was smart. He'd covered his tracks perfectly. There was no physical evidence of him accessing her files. No proof he'd tampered with anything. Her own memory problems and documented mistakes made her seem like an unreliable witness. The committee had essentially told her that without concrete proof of misconduct, they couldn't investigate a senior prosecutor based solely on a recording that might have been taken without proper consent. They'd suggested, not unkindly, that perhaps she was experiencing stress-related paranoia. That was when Patricia realized she couldn't win against Preston in Seattle. His reputation was too solid. His conviction rate was too impressive. His connections in the legal community ran too deep. So she'd left, moved to Spokane, started over with simple cases that Preston couldn't touch. She'd spent the past 2 years rebuilding her life and her sanity, always wondering when he'd find another victim. Now she knew he had. Patricia asked me if I understood what I was dealing with. She said Preston wasn't just a corrupt prosecutor. He was systematic, methodical. This was how he maintained his 93% conviction rate. He didn't just build strong cases. He destroyed the defense before trial even started. I asked the question that was burning in my throat. Was I the only one after Patricia? There was a pause so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Patricia told me about Elena Rodriguez. Elena had been a public defender in King County, brilliant and passionate about protecting defendants' rights. She'd started dating Preston about 6 months after he and Patricia broke up. Patricia had tried to warn Elena, but Elena hadn't believed her, thought Patricia was just a jealous ex. 9 months later, Elena was sanctioned by the bar for a series of ethical violations. Missing court dates, failing to file motions, evidence mishandling. Her clients had filed complaints. She'd lost her job. Last Patricia heard, Elena was working as a paralegal in Oregon, no longer licensed to practice law. My mind was racing through the implications. Preston had done this before. Multiple times. He had a pattern. He targeted successful female defense attorneys, got close to them, systematically destroyed their careers while building his own reputation on their failures. And he'd gotten away with it because he was careful. Because he chose victims who would seem unreliable when they tried to expose him. Because he operated in a system that was predisposed to believe a prosecutor over a defense attorney anyway. I asked Patricia if there were others. She said she didn't know for certain, but she suspected there might be at least one more. She'd heard rumors about a defense attorney in Tacoma who'd had a relationship with Preston years ago and had left the legal profession entirely after a series of devastating losses. But Patricia had never been able to track her down to confirm. I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. Not fear anymore. Clarity. Preston had chosen the wrong victim this time, because unlike Patricia and Elena, I had resources. I had Sloan. I had a law firm of my own. And I had something Preston didn't know about. I had learned from the best defense attorney in Seattle, my mentor Julia Blackwood, that the most important skill in law wasn't winning arguments. It was gathering evidence that couldn't be disputed. I thanked Patricia for her courage in telling me the truth, and promised I would stop Preston from doing this to anyone else. After we hung up, I sat in my office staring at the Seattle skyline as darkness fell over the city. Sloan was watching me carefully, waiting for me to process whatever Patricia had told me. I filled her in on everything, watching her expression shift from shock to anger to grim determination. She said we needed a plan, a real plan, because going after a senior prosecutor without ironclad evidence would destroy us faster than Preston ever could. That night, I went home to the house I shared with Preston in Capitol Hill. a beautiful craftsman we'd bought together 2 years ago. I'd loved this house once. The built-in bookshelves in the living room where I kept my law books. The kitchen with its vintage tile and modern appliances. The bedroom with morning light that streamed through east-facing windows. Now every corner felt contaminated. Dangerous. I looked at our wedding photos on the mantel and tried to remember the man I thought I'd married. Had any of it been real? Had Preston ever actually loved me? Or had I always just been another target in his twisted career advancement strategy? Preston came home around 8, carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He asked about my day, seemed genuinely concerned when I told him I was still upset about losing the Chen case. He said it happened to every attorney eventually, that even the best lawyers couldn't win them all, that I shouldn't be so hard on myself. His voice was so kind, so sincere. I watched him move around our kitchen, plating food and pouring wine, and marveled at how completely he'd fooled me. How completely he was still trying to fool me. He handed me my usual evening tea along with dinner. Chamomile with honey, brewed exactly the way I supposedly liked it. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and felt rage bubble up in my throat. But I forced myself to smile and thank him. I needed to pretend everything was normal while I figured out how to prove what he was doing. So I lifted the mug to my lips and pretended to drink, letting the liquid touch my mouth but not swallowing. Preston watched me for just a moment too long before turning back to his own plate. The hardest part was maintaining the facade while my mind raced through everything I now understood. The home office Preston had been so helpful in setting up. He'd insisted on configuring my computer network himself, which meant he probably had remote access to everything. The security system he'd installed 6 months ago because he was worried about break-ins in the neighborhood probably had cameras or monitoring equipment I didn't know about. Every thoughtful gesture reframed itself as manipulation. Every kindness revealed as strategy. I excused myself to use the bathroom and poured the tea down the sink, then refilled the mug with water. When I returned to the kitchen, Preston asked if I'd finished my tea. I showed him the empty mug and watched satisfaction flicker across his face. He suggested I should get some rest early tonight, that I looked exhausted. I agreed and went upstairs, but I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I lay in bed with my eyes closed, trying to keep my breathing steady and deep, listening to Preston move around downstairs. Around 11 p.m., I heard him climb the stairs. He stood in our bedroom doorway for what felt like hours. Then he said my name. Harper. Harper, are you awake? I didn't respond. I kept my breathing rhythmic and slow, the way it sounded when the drugs actually knocked me unconscious. Preston said my name again, louder this time. Still, I didn't move. Finally, I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. But instead of going to bed in the guest room like he sometimes did when he worked late, I heard him go into my home office. I waited 15 minutes, then carefully slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. My office door was closed but not latched completely. Through the crack, I could see Preston sitting at my desk, my laptop open in front of him. He was going through my case files for the Brennan trial. I watched him photograph documents with his phone. I watched him open my encrypted client communication folder, which meant he had my passwords. I watched him spend 45 minutes systematically accessing every confidential detail of my defense strategy for a trial that was scheduled to start in 3 weeks. But what made my blood freeze was watching him open a file I didn't recognize, a spreadsheet with dates and case names. I could see columns labeled target win rate, intervention timeline, and expected outcome. There were at least 6 names listed: Patricia Summers, Elena Rodriguez, 2 other names I didn't recognize, and my own name at the bottom with today's date, and a note that said Chen conviction successful, Brennan case next, timeline accelerated due to suspicious behavior. Preston knew I was suspicious. He'd noticed something was off tonight, which meant he was going to move faster now. Whatever his endgame was for destroying me, he was going to accelerate the timeline. I crept back to bed before he finished, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he'd hear it when he eventually came to check on me. He did check on me, around 1 a.m., standing over our bed and lifting my eyelids slightly to confirm I was unconscious. The violation of it made me want to scream, but I forced every muscle in my body to stay limp and unresponsive. The next morning I woke before Preston and lay very still, thinking about that spreadsheet. 6 names, 6 careers destroyed, and I was meant to be the 6th. But there was something Patricia had said that kept circling in my mind. She'd mentioned that Preston always worked with someone else, that she'd heard him on the phone coordinating with a partner, which meant this wasn't just Preston's operation. Someone else was involved. Someone who had resources and connections, and possibly even more to lose if this scheme was exposed. Over the next week, I became someone I barely recognized. During the day, I played the role of confused, struggling attorney perfectly. I let Preston see me making small mistakes, forgetting details, seeming overwhelmed by the Brennan case preparation. At night, I pretended to drink his drugged tea while actually pouring it into a sealed container I'd hidden in my nightstand. I was collecting samples for toxicology analysis, building evidence one poisoned cup at a time. And in the hours when Preston thought I was unconscious, I was actually wide awake, documenting everything. Sloan helped me install hidden cameras in my home office. Tiny devices disguised as books on the shelf, positioned to capture my desk and computer from multiple angles. We set them to activate on motion detection between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Within 3 nights, we had footage of Preston accessing my files at least a dozen times. We watched him photograph client documents. We watched him make phone calls discussing my case strategies. And most damning, we watched him edit documents on my computer, changing dates and facts just slightly, creating the kind of small errors that would make me look incompetent in court. But the cameras also captured something else. During one of his late-night sessions, Preston had a video call with someone. The angle wasn't perfect, but Sloan managed to enhance the audio and we could hear most of the conversation. The voice on the other end was male, authoritative, older. He was talking about timelines and investments and something called acquisition targets. Preston kept saying he understood, that the Caldwell firm would be available for purchase within 8 weeks, that my reputation would be sufficiently destroyed by then, that my partners would be desperate to sell. That's when I understood the full scope of what Preston was doing. This wasn't just about winning cases or feeding his ego. This was about money. Preston was systematically destroying successful female defense attorneys so that their law firms would fail. Then someone was buying those firms at bargain prices. I thought about Patricia's old firm, about Elena's public defender office, about the other names on that spreadsheet. I needed to find out who was buying these practices and what they were doing with them once they acquired them. Sloan's paralegal skills came through. She spent 2 days in the King County Records office, pulling business filings and property transfers. What she found was a shell company called Sentinel Justice Partners that had purchased 3 failed law practices in the past 4 years. Each purchase happened within months of a prominent attorney leaving or being forced out. The company was registered in Delaware with an opacity that screamed money laundering, but Sloan managed to trace it through several corporate layers to a name that made my stomach drop. Judge Warren Ashford. Judge Ashford was a recently retired King County Superior Court judge, the same judge who'd presided over several of the cases where Preston's tactics had destroyed defense attorneys' reputations. The same judge who'd sanctioned Elena Rodriguez for her supposed ethical violations. The same judge who'd dismissed Patricia Summers' complaints against Preston as unfounded. He hadn't just been complicit. He'd been orchestrating the entire operation from the bench, using his authority to legitimize Preston's sabotage while positioning himself to profit from the wreckage. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. Preston destroyed the attorneys. Ashford provided judicial cover and bought their practices cheap. Then they must have been selling those client lists and case files to someone else, because Sentinel Justice Partners didn't actually practice law. It just acquired and liquidated legal practices, which meant somewhere there was a third player in this scheme. Someone buying access to confidential attorney-client information for purposes I didn't want to imagine. I needed to know who that third player was, but investigating further meant accessing records that required legal authority I didn't have. That's when I made the decision to contact the FBI. Not the local field office where Preston probably had connections, but the Public Corruption Unit in Washington, D.C. I spent an entire day crafting a detailed memo outlining everything I'd discovered, attaching the video evidence, the toxicology report Sloan had commissioned on my tea samples showing significant amounts of benzodiazepines, the corporate records showing the connection between Preston and Ashford. The response came faster than I expected. Special Agent Nicole Chen called me 2 days later and asked if I could meet her somewhere private. We met at a coffee shop in Fremont, far from the courthouse and the legal district. Agent Chen was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and direct. She told me the FBI had been watching Judge Ashford for 6 months on an unrelated corruption investigation, but they hadn't been able to find enough evidence to move forward. What I was handing them was exactly the thread they needed to unravel his entire operation. But Agent Chen also told me something that made my blood run cold. The third player in the scheme was a data broker named Marcus Thorne, who purchased attorney-client privileged information and sold it to the highest bidder. Corporate rivals, divorce attorneys, journalists, blackmailers, anyone willing to pay for confidential legal intelligence. Thorne had been under investigation for years, but he was careful. He never touched the information directly. He just bought practices through intermediaries and extracted the valuable data before dissolving the firms. The FBI estimated he'd made over $15 million selling privileged information from the practices Ashford and Preston had helped him acquire. Agent Chen explained that taking down this operation would require careful coordination. They needed to catch Preston in the act of sabotage, Ashford facilitating it, and Thorne receiving the stolen information, which meant I had to continue playing my role as Preston's victim for at least 3 more weeks. I had to let him keep drugging me, keep accessing my files, keep destroying my reputation. The Brennan trial was scheduled to start in 17 days, and Agent Chen believed that would be when Preston made his final move. The FBI would be watching, recording, building their case. But in the meantime, I had to pretend to be the confused, failing attorney Preston thought I was. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of my life. Every morning I woke up next to a man who was systematically destroying everything I'd built, and I had to smile at him over coffee. Every night I pretended to drink poison from his hands and thanked him for taking care of me. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sometimes I'd catch myself almost forgetting that this was an act, almost slipping back into the comfortable fiction that Preston loved me, that our marriage was real. Then I'd remember the spreadsheet with 6 names on it and the cold calculation in his eyes when he thought I was unconscious. The Brennan case was falling apart exactly the way Preston had planned. My client, Jessica Brennan, was a 32-year-old software engineer accused of murdering her business partner during a dispute over their company's intellectual property. The evidence had always been largely circumstantial, but I'd had a solid defense strategy built around timeline inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. Except now documents kept disappearing from my files. Witnesses I'd interviewed were suddenly changing their statements. Evidence I'd carefully cataloged was somehow corrupted or mislabeled. Every mistake made me look incompetent, and I had to let it happen because the FBI needed Preston to commit these acts on camera. Sloan was struggling too. She had to watch our firm's reputation crumble while knowing we couldn't stop it yet. Our other partners were starting to ask questions about my performance. 2 junior attorneys had privately approached Sloan asking if I was having health problems, if maybe I should take a leave of absence. The firm we'd built together was fracturing under the weight of Preston's sabotage, and we couldn't tell anyone why we were letting it happen. Agent Chen called me every few days with updates. The FBI had confirmed Marcus Thorne was already in negotiations to purchase Caldwell and Martinez Defense Associates through a front company. They'd intercepted communications, showing he expected the firm to be available within 6 weeks, at roughly 30% of its actual value. Ashford had been making inquiries about which judges would be assigned to the Brennan trial, presumably to ensure he had someone sympathetic on the bench. Everything was falling into place exactly as the conspiracy had planned. But then something happened that wasn't part of anyone's plan. Jessica Brennan tried to kill herself in jail. The guards found her in time, but she'd written a suicide note that basically admitted to the murder, saying she couldn't live with what she'd done and couldn't face trial. Preston called me with the news, his voice professionally sympathetic, but with an undertone of barely concealed satisfaction. He said the note would likely be admissible as a statement against interest, that we should consider advising Jessica to take a plea deal. I felt physically sick knowing that Jessica's despair was part of Preston's design. I went to see Jessica in the medical unit of the jail. She looked small and broken, bandages on her wrists and shame in her eyes. She told me she was sorry for letting me down, for making my job harder with her suicide attempt. I asked her about the note, about the confession. Jessica's face crumpled and she said she didn't write most of it. She'd started a note saying she wanted to die because she couldn't handle being locked up anymore. But when the guards found her, the note had 3 pages. She'd only written half a page. Someone had added to it while she was unconscious in the medical bay. My hands went cold. Preston had access to the jail. Prosecutors frequently coordinated with corrections officers on inmate logistics. It would have been easy for him to get to Jessica's note, to add a detailed confession that would seal her conviction and destroy any remaining shred of my credibility as her attorney. But this was different from his other sabotage. This was evidence tampering in a criminal case. This was the kind of act that could get a prosecutor disbarred and prosecuted if we could prove it. I called Agent Chen immediately from my car. She told me to get the original note if possible, that the FBI could do forensic analysis on the handwriting and ink. But when I called the jail to request the note for our case file, I was told it had already been transferred to the prosecutor's evidence room per standard procedure, which meant it was now in Preston's control. I felt panic rising in my throat. If Preston had been careful, if he'd managed to fake Jessica's handwriting well enough, we'd never be able to prove the confession was fabricated. That night, Preston came home late with flowers and wine. He said he knew I was having a difficult time with the Brennan case, that he wanted to do something nice for me. "We should take a trip after the trial," he said. "Get away from Seattle for a while. Maybe go somewhere tropical where I could rest and recover from all the stress." His words were kind, but I heard the subtext clearly. After the trial, after Jessica was convicted based on a confession Preston had fabricated, after my reputation was completely destroyed, Preston would take me somewhere isolated where he could finish whatever his final plan was. I realized with absolute clarity that I wasn't going to make it to the end of the FBI's careful investigation. Preston was escalating. The fake confession showed he was getting desperate, willing to take bigger risks. And desperate men were dangerous men. I thought about the women on that spreadsheet, about Patricia and Elena who'd escaped with just their careers destroyed. But what about the other 2 names? The ones Patricia hadn't been able to track down? What if they hadn't escaped at all? I excused myself to the bathroom and texted Sloane a single word. Scared. She responded immediately. "Stay at my place tonight. Make an excuse." I went back to the living room where Preston was pouring wine and told him I had to go back to the office, that I'd remembered something important about the Brennan case that couldn't wait until morning. Preston's expression flickered, just for a second, with something that looked like calculation. Then he smiled and said, of course, that he understood, that he hoped I'd figure out whatever was troubling me. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he knew I was lying. Like he was letting me go, but keeping score. I stayed at Sloane's apartment that night, and the next 3 nights after that, telling Preston I needed space to focus on trial preparation without distractions. He seemed to accept this explanation, but I could feel his suspicion growing through our text exchanges. His messages became more frequent, more insistent. He wanted to know what I was working on, how the case preparation was going, when I'd be coming home. Each message felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Agent Chen called me on the 4th morning with news that changed everything. The FBI had been monitoring Preston's communications and had intercepted something alarming. Preston had booked a 1-way flight to Costa Rica, departing the day after the Brennan trial verdict was expected. Just one ticket. Not two. Which meant whatever Preston's plan was for me, it didn't involve us leaving the country together. Agent Chen's voice was tense when she told me this. She said the FBI was moving up their timeline, that they couldn't risk waiting any longer if Preston was planning to flee. The new plan was this. The Brennan trial would proceed as scheduled, starting Monday morning. Agent Chen would have agents positioned throughout the courthouse monitoring Preston's movements. My home office cameras would remain active to capture any final evidence tampering. And on the last day of trial, during what would normally be closing arguments, I would confront Preston with everything I knew. The FBI would be recording every word. Judge Morrison, who was presiding over the Brennan case, had been briefed by federal prosecutors and had agreed to cooperate. He would give me latitude to present evidence of Preston's corruption, even though it was technically outside the scope of the murder trial. But there was a catch. For this confrontation to work, for the evidence to be admissible, and the case against Preston to be airtight, I had to get him to confess on the record in open court. I had to be so convincing, so threatening with what I knew, that Preston would panic and try to defend himself by explaining his actions. It was a massive risk. If Preston stayed calm and denied everything, if he simply refused to engage, we'd have video evidence of him accessing my files, but potentially not enough to connect him to Ashford and Thorne. We needed his confession to unravel the entire conspiracy. I spent the weekend preparing 2 closing arguments. One was the closing I would have given if none of this had happened. A passionate defense of Jessica Brennan built on reasonable doubt and timeline inconsistencies. The other was something I'd never done before in my career. An indictment of prosecutorial corruption delivered directly to the man who'd tried to destroy me. I practiced both versions dozens of times in Sloane's living room, trying to keep my voice steady when I imagined looking Preston in the eye and calling him a criminal. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, typical Seattle weather in early May. I put on my best suit, a charcoal gray Armani that made me look every inch the competent attorney I actually was beneath all of Preston's sabotage. Sloane met me outside the courthouse and squeezed my hand. She told me I was the bravest person she knew, that no matter what happened in there, I'd already won by refusing to let Preston break me completely. I wanted to believe her, but my hands were shaking as we walked through the courthouse doors. The trial proceeded normally for the first 3 days. I presented our defense methodically, calling witnesses to establish Jessica's alibi and challenging the prosecution's timeline. Preston was his usual professional self, objecting at appropriate moments, cross-examining effectively, but not aggressively. To anyone watching, we looked like 2 attorneys doing their jobs. Only I could see the calculation behind his eyes every time he looked at me. Only I knew he was counting down to my final destruction. On Wednesday night, Preston called me and asked if I'd come home. He said he missed me, that we needed to talk about our relationship, that he was worried about me. His voice sounded genuine, concerned, exactly the way it had sounded for 4 years when I'd believed he loved me. I told him I'd come by Thursday evening after court. I could hear relief in his voice when he said he'd make dinner, that we could talk about everything then, about our future. The word future coming from his mouth made me want to vomit. Thursday morning was closing arguments. I woke up at 5 a.m. in Sloane's guest room, my stomach churning with anxiety. Agent Chen had called the night before to confirm everything was in place. FBI agents would be positioned throughout the courthouse. Federal prosecutors were on standby. Judge Morrison knew to let me speak even if Preston objected. Everything depended on the next few hours. Everything depended on me staying calm enough to execute the most important performance of my life. I arrived at the courthouse an hour early and sat in an empty attorney conference room, reviewing my notes one final time. The closing argument that would expose Preston was 12 pages long, carefully constructed to present each piece of evidence in a way that would back him into a corner. I'd start with the video footage of him accessing my computer. Then the toxicology reports showing he'd been drugging me. Then the corporate records linking him to Ashford and Thorne. Then the pattern of destroyed careers. 6 women, 6 ruined lives, And I'd end with Jessica Brennan's fabricated confession, the act of desperation that proved Preston was willing to do anything to win. At 9 a.m., Judge Morrison called the court to order. The courtroom was packed with lawyers and law students who'd come to watch closing arguments in what had become a high-profile case. Preston sat at the prosecution table looking confident and composed. He had no idea what was about to happen. No idea that every person he thought was just a spectator was actually a federal agent. No idea that this was the last day of his freedom. I stood up, walked to the podium, and began to speak. Not the closing argument anyone expected, but the closing argument that would finally deliver justice. I stood at the podium and looked directly at the jury, 12 Seattle citizens who'd spent 3 weeks listening to testimony about Jessica Brennan's alleged crime. I told them I was about to do something unprecedented in my 7 years as a defense attorney. I was about to tell them that this trial, every piece of evidence they'd heard, had been contaminated by corruption so deep it had perverted the entire justice system they were supposed to represent. Judge Morrison nodded at me to continue. Preston's face showed confusion, then the first flicker of concern. I presented the video evidence first, asking the bailiff to display footage on the courtroom monitors. The jury watched Preston Whitfield, senior prosecutor for King County, sitting at my home computer at 1:37 a.m., photographing confidential case files with his phone. I narrated what they were seeing, explaining that the man prosecuting Jessica Brennan had been secretly accessing my defense strategy for weeks, sabotaging my ability to represent my client effectively. Preston stood up and objected, his voice sharp, saying this was completely inappropriate and irrelevant to the murder case. Judge Morrison overruled him and told him to sit down. The video continued. Now the jury watched Preston editing documents on my computer, changing dates and details in witness statements I'd prepared. I explained how these small alterations had made me look incompetent in court, how they'd undermined my credibility with witnesses and experts. Preston objected again, louder this time, demanding a mistrial. Judge Morrison warned him that if he interrupted again, he'd be held in contempt. I could see Preston's mind working, trying to understand how this was happening, how I'd managed to record him without his knowledge. Then I presented the toxicology reports. I explained to the jury that the tea my husband had been making me every night for 8 months contained significant amounts of benzodiazepines, drugs that caused memory problems and cognitive impairment. I told them about the bitter aftertaste I'd ignored, about the episodes of confusion during depositions, about waking up exhausted despite supposedly sleeping soundly. I watched Preston's face go pale as he realized how much I knew, how long I'd been documenting his crimes. But I wasn't finished. I presented the corporate records showing the connection between Preston and retired Judge Warren Ashford, explaining how they'd worked together to destroy female defense attorneys and profit from buying their failed practices. I named Patricia Summers and Elena Rodriguez, asking both women to stand. They were sitting in the gallery, both having flown to Seattle at the FBI's request. The jury looked at them, at their faces marked by years of trauma, and I could see understanding dawning. This wasn't just about one corrupt prosecutor. This was systematic predation. Preston was on his feet now, his voice shaking with what might have been anger or fear. He said I was having a breakdown, that I was paranoid and unstable, that none of this was real. He turned to Judge Morrison and demanded that I be removed from the courtroom, possibly even committed for psychiatric evaluation. It was exactly the tactic he'd used on Patricia, on Elena, on the others. Discredit the victim by claiming mental illness. But this time, it wasn't going to work. I pulled out the fabricated confession from Jessica Brennan, the suicide note that had been mysteriously expanded while she was unconscious in the medical bay. I had forensic handwriting analysis showing that only the first half page was in Jessica's hand. The rest, the detailed confession that Preston had planned to use to secure conviction, was written by someone else. Someone who'd had access to the jail. Someone who'd been desperate enough to manufacture evidence when his other sabotage tactics weren't working fast enough. That's when Preston made his fatal mistake. He started explaining. He said the confession was legitimate, that I was misrepresenting the forensic analysis, that Jessica had clearly written the entire note. He said his access to my computer was innocent, that married couples often shared devices and passwords. He said the tea he'd been making me was just tea, that if I'd submitted it for testing, I must have contaminated the samples. Every denial dug him deeper. Every explanation revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had if he was innocent. I looked at Preston and asked him directly how many women he'd destroyed before me, how many careers he'd ended, how many lives he'd ruined. He stared at me with pure hatred now, the mask completely gone. He told me I had no idea what I was dealing with, that I was going to regret this, that people like me didn't understand how the system really worked. The system rewarded winners, he said. The system didn't care about naive defense attorneys who thought they could protect guilty people. Someone had to maintain order. Someone had to make sure convictions happened. And if that meant eliminating incompetent defense attorneys, then that was just survival of the fittest. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Preston seemed to realize what he'd just admitted, how his words had sounded. He turned to Judge Morrison and demanded that everything I'd presented be stricken from the record, that this entire proceeding was a setup. Judge Morrison looked at Preston with an expression I'd never seen from him before, something like disgust mixed with profound disappointment. He told Preston he was going to want to remain silent now, because anything else he said would be used against him. That's when Agent Chen stood up from where she'd been sitting in the gallery. She identified herself as FBI Special Agent Nicole Chen and informed Preston that he was under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and multiple counts of violating attorney-client privilege. Other agents moved through the courtroom, also arresting Judge Warren Ashford, who'd been sitting in the back row, apparently unable to resist watching Preston's final performance. Ashford's face had gone gray. Preston looked at me one last time as the agents handcuffed him. He said I'd won this round, but that I had no idea how deep this went, that Thorne had resources I couldn't imagine, that I'd never be safe. I told him I wasn't afraid of Marcus Thorne or anyone else in his network, because unlike the women he'd destroyed before me, I hadn't fought back alone. I'd had help, and I'd made sure every piece of evidence was documented, verified, and backed up in locations he could never access. As they led Preston out of the courtroom, I turned back to Judge Morrison and formally requested dismissal of all charges against Jessica Brennan due to prosecutorial misconduct and fabricated evidence. He granted the motion immediately. Jessica burst into tears in her seat at the defense table. The jury looked stunned. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 months. I felt like myself again. 6 months after Preston's arrest, I stood in the renovated offices of Caldwell and Martinez Defense Associates, looking out at Elliott Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows we'd installed during the remodel. The firm hadn't just survived Preston's sabotage. We'd grown stronger. We'd added 4 new partners, expanded to 2 floors, and had a waiting list of clients who wanted representation from the attorneys who'd taken down one of the most corrupt prosecutorial schemes in Washington state history. Our reputation wasn't damaged anymore. It was legendary. Preston was awaiting trial in the same county jail where he'd once had unlimited access to manipulate inmates and evidence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He'd been denied bail after prosecutors presented evidence that he'd been planning to flee to Costa Rica. His one-way ticket, purchased weeks before his arrest, had sealed his fate. Federal prosecutors had charged him with 67 counts across multiple categories of corruption. His trial was scheduled for February, and the prosecutor's office estimated he was looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Judge Warren Ashford had taken a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Preston and Marcus Thorne, he'd received 12 years instead of the life sentence he'd been facing. He'd already provided detailed testimony about how the scheme worked, how he'd used his position on the bench to facilitate Preston's sabotage while positioning himself to profit from the destroyed law practices. Watching him admit his crimes in his deposition had been satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. This man had worn judicial robes, had taken an oath to uphold justice, and he'd sold it all for money. Marcus Thorne was fighting extradition from the Cayman Islands, where he'd fled the day after Preston's arrest. But the FBI was confident they'd get him back to the United States within the year. They'd frozen his assets, shut down his data brokerage operations, and arrested 17 people in his network who'd been buying and selling privileged attorney-client information. The scope of the damage Thorne had caused was still being calculated, but it appeared his operation had compromised hundreds of legal cases over a decade. Jessica Brennan was free and rebuilding her software company. She'd sued King County for wrongful prosecution and settled for an undisclosed amount that her attorney told me was substantial. She'd called me last month to say thank you, to tell me she'd named her company's new legal AI product Harper in my honor. I'd laughed and told her I hoped the AI was better at spotting corrupt prosecutors than I'd been at spotting my corrupt husband. Patricia Summers had moved back to Seattle and joined our firm as a senior partner. Watching her walk into court again for the first time in 3 years had made me cry. She'd been terrified, certain that she'd forgotten how to do trial work, convinced that Preston had broken something in her that couldn't be fixed. But the moment she stood up to give her opening statement in a robbery case, I saw the brilliant attorney she'd always been emerge. She won that case. She'd won every case since. Patricia was exactly what Preston had tried to destroy, a woman who refused to stay destroyed. Elena Rodriguez had gotten her law license reinstated after the Bar Association reviewed her case in light of Preston's crimes. She'd decided not to practice criminal defense anymore, said the trauma was too deep, but she'd become a professor at Seattle University School of Law teaching legal ethics. She told me she wanted to make sure the next generation of lawyers understood how corruption worked, how to spot it, how to fight it. I guest lectured in her class once and saw the fire in her eyes when she talked about protecting the integrity of the legal system. Preston hadn't broken her either. He'd forged her into something stronger. The other 2 women from Preston's spreadsheet had been harder to find. One, Amanda Foster, had died 2 years ago in what had been ruled a suicide, but was now being reinvestigated as a possible homicide. The FBI believed Preston might have killed her when she'd gotten too close to exposing him. The other, Lisa Chen, had disappeared completely. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no digital footprint. I thought about her sometimes, wondered if she was out there somewhere living under a new name, or if Preston had done something to her that we'd never be able to prove. That uncertainty haunted me. My divorce from Preston was finalized 3 months after his arrest. I'd fought the urge to attend the hearing, to see him one more time, but my therapist had advised against it. She said I needed to let Preston become part of my past, rather than a continued presence in my present. She was right. The divorce papers arrived in the mail on a Tuesday afternoon, and I threw them in the recycling without reading them. I didn't need closure from Preston. I'd gotten closure the moment I'd watched federal agents take him away in handcuffs. Therapy had been essential. 2 sessions a week for the first 3 months. Then once a week after that. I'd been diagnosed with complex PTSD from the prolonged psychological abuse and drugging. There were still nights when I woke up panicked, convinced I was back in that house with Preston standing over me while I pretended to be unconscious. There were still moments when I doubted my own memories, wondered if I'd really been as impaired as I thought, or if I was exaggerating. My therapist kept reminding me that gaslighting left scars that took time to heal, that learning to trust my own perceptions again was a process. But I was healing. Slowly. Imperfectly. Some days were harder than others. I still couldn't drink tea. Still flinched when someone offered to make me a beverage. Still checked my office obsessively for hidden cameras even though I knew they weren't there. Trauma changed you in ways that didn't just disappear once the threat was gone. I was learning to live with that, to accept that I wasn't the same Harper who'd married Preston 4 years ago. I was someone different now. Someone harder in some ways, but also someone more compassionate toward other victims of abuse. Sloan and I had started a pro bono initiative at the firm, specifically for attorneys who'd been victimized by judicial or prosecutorial corruption. We'd helped 6 lawyers in the past 6 months get their cases reviewed, their sanctions overturned, their reputations restored. It turned out Preston and Ashford weren't the only corrupt actors in the legal system. They were just the ones who'd finally gotten caught. Every attorney we helped felt like a small victory against the network of people who thought they could manipulate justice for personal gain. I'd been asked to speak at legal conferences about prosecutorial misconduct and attorney wellness. The first time I told my story to a room full of lawyers, I'd been terrified. But when I finished, 3 women approached me privately and said they'd experienced similar situations with prosecutors or opposing counsel who'd been sabotaging them. They'd thought they were alone, thought they were crazy, thought no one would believe them. Knowing my story had given them courage to investigate their own situations made every difficult moment of going public worth it. The American Bar Association had launched an investigation into how Preston's corruption had gone undetected for so long. They were implementing new oversight mechanisms, requiring more transparency in prosecutorial conduct, creating systems for attorneys to report suspicious patterns without fear of retaliation. It wasn't enough, not really. Systemic change in the legal profession moved slowly, hampered by traditions and hierarchies that protected bad actors. But it was something. It was a start. I'd started dating again, cautiously. A professor at the University of Washington. I'd met at one of Elena's legal ethics lectures. He was kind and patient, and understood when I needed space. We'd been seeing each other for 2 months, and I hadn't told him I loved him yet. Wasn't sure I could say those words again after Preston had taught me how meaningless they could be. But I was learning to trust again, learning to believe that not everyone had hidden motives. Learning that my inability to spot Preston's deception didn't mean I was fundamentally broken at reading people. It meant Preston was exceptionally good at lying. Today, I was preparing for opening statements in a murder case that would have terrified me 6 months ago. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd faced down the most corrupt prosecutor in King County and won. I'd exposed a conspiracy that had destroyed careers and lives. I'd survived being poisoned by someone who'd promised to love me. A difficult trial was just another day at work now. I'd learned something essential through everything Preston had put me through. I'd learned that I was stronger than I ever knew, that I could trust my instincts, that I could fight back against people with more power than me and win. Standing in my office that morning, I thought about the Harper who'd stood in the courthouse bathroom 6 months ago, confused and terrified and doubting her own sanity. I wished I could go back and tell her that everything would be okay, that she was right to be suspicious, that the nightmare she was living through would end, that she'd not only survive, but find a way to help other people survive too. But maybe that past Harper had known somehow. Maybe that's why she'd kept fighting even when it seemed hopeless. Maybe that's why she'd documented everything and reached out for help instead of accepting Preston's gaslighting. I picked up my trial binder and headed to court. Jessica Brennan had sent flowers to the office this morning, with a card that said, "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." I thought about that phrase. How many invisible people were in our justice system right now? How many defendants with inadequate representation? How many victims of corruption who didn't have the resources to fight back? How many attorneys being sabotaged who thought they were just failing? That's what Preston had tried to make me. Invisible. Incompetent. Erased. But I'd refused to disappear. And now, every case I won, every client I protected, every corrupt official I exposed, was proof that I existed, that I mattered, that Preston Whitfield's attempt to destroy me had failed spectacularly. If you're reading this, if you're experiencing something similar, if someone in your life is making you doubt your own competence and sanity, please listen to me. Trust yourself. Document everything. Reach out for help. You're not crazy. You're not failing. You're being sabotaged. And you can fight back. It won't be easy. It will be terrifying and exhausting, and there will be moments when you want to give up. But you're stronger than whoever is trying to destroy you. You're stronger than you know. I walked into King County Superior Court that morning, with my head high and my evidence prepared. The jury would hear the truth. Justice would be served. And somewhere, Preston was sitting in a cell, realizing that destroying Harper Caldwell had been the worst mistake of his criminal career. Because I didn't just survive him. I made sure he'd never destroy anyone else again. That's not revenge. That's justice. And justice, real justice, is the most powerful force in any legal system. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about fighting back against corruption. Like if you believe attorneys have a duty to protect the innocent, even when the system itself is broken. And remember that your voice matters, your truth matters, and no one has the right to make you invisible. Not prosecutors, not judges, not anyone. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a trial to win.